Good morning, I'm Tamara Shoemaker. All right, I'm going to go all nerdy on you for a few minutes, which should surprise exactly no one. I love books, I love stories. One of my favorite stories is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that she published in 1813. And recently, my oldest daughter came and asked if we could watch the 6-hour movie version that had come out in 1995 of the story. So we did. We took 2 days last week and we watched one half each day. Side note, never underestimate the joy of getting to watch something that you enjoyed so much at your own daughter's age, and then she comes and asks you to do it. That was so much fun. Anyway, never fails. I always blissfully lose myself in the happily ever after ending for Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet in the story. And that's a spoiler, but I figured since the story's been around since 1813, really, you got no excuse if you haven't already read or seen it. So the whole story is wrapped around the fact that in order for the Bennet family to find their happily ever after, at least one of the 5 Bennet girls needs to marry a rich man, or they'll all be destitute after the dad dies, right? Mr. Bennet dies. So 2 rich guys move into the neighborhood, and oh hey, they're both single, so that's perfect. Except that Mom Bennet is super embarrassing and over-the-top annoying, and Dad Bennet barely manages to tolerate her by ignoring her, or now and then he tosses out some witty but cutting remark on her character. So both of them also avoid a lot of parental responsibility because it's all just too much. They got 5 daughters, whatever. Anyway, consequently, the 2 younger Bennet girls are also super annoying and embarrassing, and because nobody takes the trouble to train them up in the way they should go. That's Proverbs 22:6. For those who may not be familiar. The middle daughter, Mary Bennet, reads books, doesn't overly contribute to the story. And somehow, and maybe miraculously given the circumstances, the 2 older Bennet girls, Jane and Elizabeth, wind up both with common sense and some idea of what is right and acceptable in society. So, the circumstances brought to Jane and Elizabeth by their mother and their younger sisters, and even occasionally by their father, are all the more horrific for them because none of Jane and Elizabeth's actions are inappropriate, right? They mind their manners. They do the things they're supposed to do. They find themselves in interesting relationships with these 2 single and very wealthy men who have moved into the neighborhood. And it all might have worked out, besides the major theme of Pride and Prejudice, sort of very evident between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. It all might have worked out except for the actions of the rest of the family. The youngest Bennet girl, Lydia, decides to elope with the story's villain, Mr. Wickham, and then to add insult to injury, it comes out that Lydia hasn't eloped after all, but rather decides just to move in and live unmarried with Mr. Wickham. The enormity of the scandal, then, committed by Lydia and Mr. Wickham should have involved only Lydia and Mr. Wickham, right? But it doesn't, because since Lydia messed up, the whole family, as Elizabeth once burst out in frustration, must partake of her ruin and disgrace. And Mr. Darcy, by all appearances, withdraws. He leaves the picture. Jane's chances with the other single man, Mr. Bingley, also seem to be over, and so the whole story should be over. Except it's not, because when nobody's watching, Mr. Darcy, because of his ardent love for Elizabeth, does the unthinkable. He finds the perpetrators, he pays the funds that had previously been unpayable by anyone else, and he fixes the whole issue. And Lydia and Mr. Wickham marry, and they move so far north that there's really not much chance of ever, having to deal with them again very much. Elizabeth's kind of wild sister Kitty improves when she's outside of Lydia's influence. Mary keeps on reading her books. And Elizabeth marries Mr. Darcy. Jane marries her rich love interest, Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet, while still annoying, has now fulfilled her purpose in life, which is to have at least one of her daughters marry a rich man. And now she's got 2 of them married to rich people. And she becomes somewhat less annoying. And Mr. Bennet greatly enjoys himself by enclosing himself in the libraries of his 2 rich sons-in-law. So, happily ever after for pretty much everybody. Why did I just give you a Pride and Prejudice Cliff's Notes summary? All right. Because Romans 5:12-21 tells the same story, just way better, because it's true and it applies to us, and our happily ever after is not fictionalized, it's real. So, way back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And Paul reminds the Romans to whom he's writing of this man whom God had created, whose name was Adam. And he also reminds them of exactly what it was that Adam did. Adam sinned. And we could have a nice long drawn out conversation on, but Eve sinned first, so why does Adam get the blame? But I'll save that for another day. Anyway, therefore, says Paul, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sinned, that's Romans 5:12. In other words, because Adam sinned, the entire family of humankind, all 7+ billion people, nearly 8 billion people currently living in this world right now, along with the billions who have gone before us, must partake of Adam's ruin and disgrace. Every single one of us. No matter how good we are, or how much we try to do the right thing, or how much we mind our manners, or how many wealthy friends we have, the point is, not one of us has any chance, not one chance of getting out of life untainted by sin because of Adam's choice. As my daughter so richly puts it, boo, Adam. And I'm tempted to join in when she does that, because until I remember, if it hadn't been for Adam, it would have been me. If it wasn't Eve, it would have been me. I remember my frailty, my lack of strength, the way temptations just so easily stride through my life and leave me flailing in their wake. And I realize Adam, Eve, any one of us could and would have messed it up for everybody else. But God already had a plan that contrasted with Adam's sin, and he intended to give it to us, no strings attached. And he called it salvation by justification. In other words, Jesus, who had never sinned, died in the place of every single sin-filled person on this planet and made it possible to find our happily ever after in heaven. We can't do that with sin. With the gift that Jesus gives us, though, we can. We have our own happily ever after. Paul says, but the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, that was Adam, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? That's Romans 5:15. How much more awesome was it that Mr. Darcy, who should have wanted nothing to do with the Bennets by all societal standards, because it seemed that everything that touched them was now repulsive due to Lydia's actions, chose instead to enter into the family's disgrace, turn the disgrace around, and fix the disgrace, and still marry Elizabeth after all that. What a story of redemption, right? What an exponentially greater story of redemption that Jesus did for us. He waded into the slimy, disgusting pit of hopelessness and despair brought on by sin, and he fixed it. He turned the sin around, and he became righteousness for us. One of my favorite passages from Scripture is found in Daniel chapter 7. And I know I've written about it on my blog before, the whole passage out quite a few times, actually, because it's one of my favorites. But I'm going to do it again. It's just awesome. So picture the scene. As I, Daniel, looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels... He's got wheels on his throne. His wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Daniel 7:9-10. Ah, such a good scene. All rise, court is in session. The Ancient of Days is presiding. The defendant is you. The defendant is me. It's every single one of us. Sin has brought us here, and the reckoning is at hand. We are all guilty. There is no excuse. Nothing can be done except. Counselor, approach the bench. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority and glory and sovereign power. All peoples and nations and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. It's Daniel 7:13-14. Not guilty. The gavel comes down and we are free to go. Isn't that awesome? Doesn't that just blow your mind or your heart, whatever? We are so entrenched in sin, but because Jesus approached the bench, because he could approach the bench being the sinless Son of God that he was, we are free. We're free. One more scene from Revelation chapter 22, and look at this. Then the angel showed me, John this time, the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb. So a lot of this, I didn't put this in the blog, but there is a lot of mixture of water and fire, cleansing from water, cleansing from fire. You can find it in Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, I believe. But just there's so much of that imagery throughout the Bible, and I just now noticed the contrast between the river of fire flowing from the throne of God and the river of water, the river of the water of life flowing from the throne of God. I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, moving on. Then the angel showed me, John, the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the city stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. No longer will there be any curse. That curse is sin, and Jesus himself removes that curse. Not guilty. Not guilty. We're free to go. All we have to do, the only requirement that he asks of us, is that we have to drop the chains that he already broke for us. We've got to stop dragging our chains around with us. Drop them, step back. We're free to go. I'm free. You're free. Hallelujah. That's what I had for today. We're going to start Romans chapter 6 tomorrow. Moving into the second half of Romans. It's almost the second half of Romans. It's going to be good. We'll see you then.